So today, we're going to dig into the history of the opioid epidemic here in the United States. And look, this is a really complex story. Its roots stretch back more than 200 years, and it's just filled with good intentions that led to some really devastating consequences. All right, let's get into it. This right here is the big question, the central paradox we're going to try and unravel. It's a story about how a very human, a very noble goal, the desire to relieve suffering, somehow, almost accidentally, set the stage for one of the worst public health crises we've ever seen. How did that happen?
You know, the best way to understand this whole story is to think of a giant pendulum. For more than a century, the way medicine has dealt with opioids has just swung wildly between two extremes. On one side, you have this paralyzing fear of addiction that left millions of people in agony. And on the other, an all-out war on pain that led to massive overprescription and a whole new addiction crisis.
Okay, so let's set the stage. If you go back before the 1800s, pain was just, well, it was a part of life. You just dealt with it. But in the 19th century, that all started to change. Pain became a medical problem, something to be fought, something to be conquered. And science was ready with an answer.
First came morphine, which became widely available back in the 1820s. But the real game changer, that came in 1898 when the company Bayer started marketing a new drug called heroin, and get this, it was a supposedly non-addictive cough treatment. Well, the result was pretty predictable. By 1910, America was in the middle of its first big opioid epidemic, and that forced the government to step in with the Harrison Narcotic Control Act in 1914.
And boom, this is where that pendulum starts its first massive swing. The Harrison Act kicks off this era of intense fear around opioids, creating a climate that people would later call opiophobia. To really understand the impact of that fear, just listen to this quote. I mean, this wasn't some minor shift. Doctors were so terrified of creating addicts that they would actually deny pain relief even to terminally ill cancer patients until they were in the final weeks of their lives. It's just staggering to think about.
This fear got so bad, it actually got its own name, opiophobia. It was basically an irrational fear that even the proper, medically supervised use of these drugs would just automatically lead to addiction. And this way of thinking, it dominated medicine for over 50 years. Patients suffered immensely because of it.
But you know, you can only push back against something for so long, right? Starting in the 1970s, a really powerful backlash started to build. A new generation of doctors and researchers began arguing that this fear was causing its own crisis, a crisis of undertreated pain. It was time for that pendulum to swing all the way back. And the first signs of this new crusade started showing up in studies like this one from 1973. Researchers found that patients in hospitals were still in terrible pain simply because doctors didn't know enough about the drugs and were, frankly, dramatically overestimating how risky they were.
Then came this single number that would change everything. In 1980, a tiny letter to the editor, not even a full study, was published in a major medical journal. It looked at almost 12,000 hospitalized patients who got an opioid, and it found only 4 documented cases of addiction. This one little piece of data, suggesting a risk of just 0.03%, became the rallying cry for treating pain much more aggressively.
And look, this wasn't just happening in some stuffy academic journals. This was going mainstream. In 1986, the World Health Organization gave the movement huge moral authority by declaring that yes, relief from pain was a universal human right.
And the momentum just kept building. By 1995, the American Pain Society took it even further. They argued that pain should be treated as the 5th vital sign. It was just as critical for doctors to check on and manage as your blood pressure, your heart rate, your temperature, and your breathing. The pendulum had swung completely to the other side.
So now you have this perfect environment, right? Pain is the enemy, and addiction seems like this tiny, trivial risk. Well, this created the perfect opening for a new weapon in that war on pain, a powerful, long-lasting opioid called OxyContin.
And this thinking went all the way to the top. When the FDA approved OxyContin back in late 1995, its own label included this claim that the slow-release formula actually made it less addictive. It was a critical, and as we now know, a disastrously wrong assumption. So in the late 90s, all these different pieces fall into place, and you get this perfect storm. You have medical boards telling doctors, hey, don't worry, prescribe what you need to. You have states like California passing laws that force doctors to assess pain, and all of it is being fueled by these super aggressive marketing campaigns that constantly downplayed the risks of addiction.
And the result? Well, it was absolutely staggering. Back in 1991, there were 76 million opioid prescriptions filled in the U.S. By 2009, that number had exploded to over 200 million. The war on pain was in full swing. But as the new millennium kicked off, the devastating consequences of this prescribing boom became impossible to ignore. A new epidemic wasn't just brewing, it was absolutely igniting. The numbers were just terrifying. By 2003, an estimated 2.8 million people were using OxyContin for non-medical reasons. That was up from just 400,000 only 4 years earlier. The drug was just flooding the streets. So the authorities, they started to react, but it was slow. The first real step came in 2001, when the FDA finally removed that low addiction risk claim from OxyContin's label, then a warning in 2003. By 2007, the manufacturer, Purdue Pharma, was found guilty of misbranding and had to pay over $600 million in fines. It wasn't until 2009 that the FDA really started developing much stricter safety programs for all opioids.
And what's so fascinating is you can look at what was happening elsewhere. This table shows regulations over in Europe back in 1992. In places like Spain and Italy, doctors needed special prescription forms, and patients actually had to show their ID. These simple controls, which just didn't exist in the US, were enough to prevent a similar crisis from ever taking hold over there.
So we end up back where we started, with this really tough question. The entire story, from the fear of opioids to the crusade against pain, was driven by doctors trying to do the right thing. So if the goal was compassion, but the result was this absolute catastrophe, what does that teach us about the unintended consequences of our own best intentions? It's something to think about.